start. Good afternoon, everyone. We're almost there. Penultimate lecture. We're finishing in 2 weeks. So this will be the last method to cover in those compulsory seminars. And we'll continue talking about the texts today. So as you remember, last time we talked about qualitative approaches to text. Today we'll talk about quantitative approaches. We will discuss different types of sources that can be analyzed with this analysis. We will explore strengths and weaknesses, and we will use a number of examples to contextualize all the analytical procedures we need to keep in check. So, as we said last week, there are different types of textual analysis, and we covered these last time, and we called them qualitative techniques because they were exploring a limited sample, a small sample, but deeply in context with relation to power, hegemony, ideology, culture. Today, we will look at quantitative approaches which are looking to analyze a large sample of texts, but they do it a bit more superficially. So quantitative content analysis or just content analysis, different scholars, different names. Some people also distinguish qualitative content analysis. That's why they feel they need to specify. But usually content analysis, CA, is a quantitative research technique. It's a study of communication content. As Krippendorff says, it's a research technique for making replicable and valid inferences from data to their context. Or put more simply, it's a method which allows us to quantify, to count, to represent with numbers the presence or absence of something in large amount of data. So put very simply, we're looking for presence or absence or something in a huge amount of data. Whether there will be a presence of certain words or characters in images or colors or light in a movie. We're looking for something that is in the text that we can say it's there or it's not. How is this different from qualitative approaches discussed last week? Number of things. First of all, the sample is different. I mentioned it 100 times. I'll say it again. We use a large sample, but it's also a representative sample, right? So we will be very careful with quantitative content analysis that the sample represents the whole population of texts accurately, right? That the sample will have the same features as all text in this category. Why we do that? Because we want to make this study, we want to make generalizations, right? Generalization is where we will take a number of texts, let's say 100 tweets, and based on what we find on those tweets, if they are representative, we will say, well, all tweets have these features. Right? In order for us to say it, to generalize it, we need to make sure that our sample is representative. Another feature of content analysis is that it is replicable. Right? Our previous approaches to textual analysis were not replicable. When we did discourse analysis, we made a point of saying different analysis will yield different results because of the fact that analysis is so culturally contextualized, right? It's very dependent on context. It's very dependent on what we're looking for, what is the research question. Different meanings might emerge from the analysis because we're not just looking at text. In content analysis, we're only looking at text. So that means that potentially, if each of us coded the same text using the same categories, content analysis, we will all get the same result. Right? It's replicable. Right? I give you the text, I give you the procedures, and presumably we both should have the same result. Right? That's the replicability. And we achieve it again by not going deep, but by staying of what's explicitly there in the text or in the image or in the movie. It's there, but not what is around it, not what the discourse is, but what is just there. So this limits us a little bit in terms of questions we can ask. When we have tweets by Donald Trump, which are a rich source of various types of analysis, with content analysis, what could we do with tweets? Well, we could look at things to count. We could look at number of likes and retweets. We could look at how many times Donald Trump uses the word I in his tweets, for example. Right? We could count that. We could then compare it with the number of times Barack Obama used the word I, for example. And it might tell us something about how they present themselves. Maybe. Right? We could see, some people made the argument about, the different types of vocabulary used, right? So we can use what kind of vocabulary is there. We could count the number of syllables. We can use, we could calculate an average length of a tweet. We could try to do very simply some sentiment analysis, whether this tweet is positive, negative, or neutral. Although now we're starting to get a bit problematic, right? These categories might not be as clear for us to do that. So with discourse analysis, we could then go and say, well, let's look at the policies, let's look at the United States in 2019, let's see what is the political discourse, the social discourse, power. We don't do that here. Here, we look at these 200 tweets, let's say, and count things. So we'll spend the rest of the session going through procedures which are quite systematic and quite important to keep to. Now, these research steps might go in a slightly different order for you. You might add some steps, you might skip a step when something will not be applicable. Roughly, this is what you should be doing in content analysis. As everything else, we start with a research question. That's the same for all methodologies. What is a bit new here is that we also think of hypothesis. In quantitative research, more than qualitative research, we think of a hypothesis, a statement which we will prove or disprove. So here, my hypothesis was that Donald Trump will have more I personal pronouns than Barack Obama, for example, right? And we can prove it with proving by coding. You probably have more than one in a content analysis study. There might be some main hypothesis and then some subsequent hypothesis branching off the main hypothesis. The next step is for us to decide what we are studying. So population, sample, coding units. In my example of Trump tweets, right, the population will be all tweets that Donald Trump ever tweeted, right, because we're interested in that. I might decide, well, I'm only actually interested in the tweets since he became president. Right? So again, so limits us a little bit. That's my population. From the time he was elected until now. That's the population. That's a huge amount of tweets. We can't analyze that, right? So we need to distinguish a sample, a representative sample of all of those tweets. I'll talk about this later and how we might be doing it. And then a coding unit. What is our coding unit? This one is simple. Our coding unit is a tweet. Then around that time, probably simultaneously, we would be deciding how to operationalize our research question. So how to turn our research question into something researchable. this would be categories which we will then use to code our texts. Then we collect our data manually or automatically. We store it somewhere on our desk on a hard drive, on a USB stick, but we need to have all the actual materials at a time. We do it in one go. We don't do it in different periods, especially with online data, because the data might change. So we need to be very specific when the data is being collected. So we have the data, we have the question, we have the coding frame. Next step is conducting a pilot analysis. So we need to make sure that our code book, our categories make sense, they are replicable, they tell us what we need to know. So what we do is we take a subset of our data. We take, let's say, 10% of all our tweets or movies or articles or images or whatever we have, but roughly 10%. And we code it using our tools. We see if it works. Then we give that 10% of our coding to a different person. We will call them intercoder. Right? It may be a friend, it may be a family member, it may be a stranger. Right? It will be your intercoder. You need to have another person who will do the sample coding with you. Right? You tell them how to do it. You give them the categories, you tell them what's the research question, you explain the study, but they code independently without you. Right? Then you compare the results. Right? If they are high enough, if you're compatible, that means that your tools are okay. Usually, not all categories are okay. There are some discrepancies. That's why we do pilots, right? So then we go back and we do some revisions. We might decide that some of the categories we might have to let go, some of them we might improve, and the rest are fine. Once we've acquired a satisfactory intercoder reliability level, we can code. We code the rest of the materials. We go through all of the tweets from my example, and we code them according to the categories that we decided on. And then we have it all coded. It's time to look for some patterns. It's time to see this data as a whole. Right? So this is where we play with this data. We aggregate, we cross-tabulate, we conduct statistical analysis, and we have, as we call, the results. Right? We see the pattern, we see the frequencies, we see the probabilities. That's really it. The last thing that is then left for us is to write up those findings in a interesting, relevant way that will include both the results and our explanation of the results. So I'll cover this for the rest of the session, some points more than others. Starting from, well, this is the case study we'll be working on, which I came up with just now. We will look at The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, as you know well. And just looking at The Guardian covers, this is the first page, the front page of Guardian recently and 5 years ago. I might think that maybe there's something there about how the content changed on the covers. Maybe my hunch, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but my hunch is that there used to be much more text. There used to be much more content. And now there's more. The images are larger, the fonts are bigger, so there's a lot of graphics, right? So there's less and less information. Well, that's my hypothesis. My research question would be, I could call it maybe tabloidization of press. Is press getting more tabloid-like, which means, big headlines, big images, not much content. Does this reflect the neoliberal era of journalism? Right? So my research question is whether we are witnessing, whether we can observe tabloidization of press, an example of Guardian now and then. So this is a type of research question for content analysis because it asked about change over time. Just like I did now, good research question for content analysis will start from theory and previous research. In my case, it was tabloidization of press, which is a widely covered issue. And good question would ask about trends and patterns very often. Especially effective will be questions that let us compare stuff. I compared the same newspaper over time, but we could be comparing different places, so media and platforms from different countries, different regions. We can look at different platforms. Right? In my marketing class, we compared marketing strategies of a certain brand across Instagram and Weibo. Right? This also could be analyzed through content analysis. Right? But we will be comparing something. We will be looking for a certain pattern. So, when it comes to materials, this is similar to what we talked about 2 weeks ago, right? The big advantage of content analysis is that we can analyze virtually anything with content analysis. We call them text because it's textual analysis, but just like 2 weeks ago, our definition of text is very wide. Text might be an image. What we mean by text could be a movie, a GIF, code, an object, a place, a song, and so on. Right? So we will be using this terminology of text, but we're treating, remember, every time the text as a very wide category of things that can be analyzed. So text can be both primary and secondary sources. Right? Primary sources, archival materials from that era, or secondary sources, sources which cover primary sources when people were writing about those materials. The text could be recent, like mine were recent, was now and 5 years ago, or they can go way back. Right? Just because we're doing digital research and it sounds new and recent doesn't mean that we can't reach very, very far back in history. In fact, historical sources are very widely used in digital research. Particularly when we ask about comparisons over time, using old sources allows us to see current events in a wider context and see whether the things that we think are new, phenomena that we think are specific to our era, are they so really? Are they really unprecedented or important? So the most widely used example here is fake news, right? We think of fake news as this quite recent phenomena of the digital era, but there are numerous examples, hundreds and centuries ago, where even though we didn't call them fake news, but the phenomena was very, very similar. So any data, recent or historical, with one caveat, there is online data is a bit tricky, and I'll talk about this in a second. But where to find materials? We live in a very lucky age for that, because there's just so many archives and there's so many databases for us to use, right? So my example was with newspapers. Archive of newspapers are widely available. Box of broadcasts, right, have archives of television content, right? We have archives of all sorts of mediated content, and we also have databases which include public databases, sort of NGO databases, private databases, which gather all sorts of data which might be interesting for us. Obviously the web and social media, with all the challenges that it entails, crawlers, capturing tools, or manually, and anything really could be used as a material provided that the data is collected systematically. So with online data, the tricky aspect is, as I mentioned, that the contents change dynamically. So what happens if the content changes while we collect the data? Right? We collect tweets, the tweet disappears. We looked at online comments, the comment gets edited. Right? Very often it happens, right, on social media, but also in journalism. Guardian would release an article in the morning and they will edit it in the afternoon with some additional information or rectifying something that was wrong. Right? So then what do? We might not have the original one anymore. We've collected it, or maybe the original one doesn't reflect what is there now. These are the small things that we need to be careful about, and we need to address them when we will be writing that up. Problems of formats. Different archives, again, depending on what your text is, but different archives might not be compatible with each other. How will you compare them if they are presented in completely different formats? And all sorts of ethical issues, especially related to online materials, whether gathering texts from social media, are these public or private? It might depend on the platform, it might depend on the terms of service, it might depend on what kind of research you're doing and what you're doing with the data. And the answer to what kind of consent is needed for that, whether this data public or private, whether it requires to be anonymized. It is heavily contextual, but in any case needs to be addressed. So sampling, I mentioned sampling. We cannot analyze everything, usually. We need to identify a subset of all population, call it a sample, make sure it's representative, and analyze that smaller subset. There's a number of ways in which we can do that. The simplest type of sampling is random. We just randomly choose the number of text that we need. Right? So let's say on my Guardian example, I wanted to contrast 100 covers from 2019 with 100 front pages from 2014. Right? So I need 100 from each of the years, Guardian Monday to Friday, so 5 days a week. So that's 260-ish covers. I need to identify 100 of them. I could do it randomly. I could say, just throw it in some random number generator and give me a random 100. It might be a way to do it. It's not always best for all categories. More often, systematic sampling is being used, right? So we say we take every second or every third material. Or we will only have covers from Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but not Tuesday and Thursday. Stratified sampling is used when we have different categories of text within our population. So in my example, actually, we had only Guardian, but we had 2 dates. Right? So I need to make sure that I have an even number of text from 2019, 2014. So that's already stratified sample, right? I don't want to have it all random. I want to have 100 from this year and 100 from that year. What if we wanted to compare Guardian and the Independent? Right? That's another variable to include. Right? I don't want it to have randomly. I want to have an even number of Guardian and Independent articles from each year. So I would say, yes, it can be random, but I need to have 50 from Guardian 2019, 50 from Guardian 2014, and the same with Independent. So that's not exactly random because we're introducing those categories in stratified sampling. So some of these approaches might be mixed, and some might depend on how widely is your data available and how it is systematized. Okay. So, getting back to our example, we have the research question about tabloidization of press. We have my hypothesis that there will be less what we call journalist original content, written content, information now than it was before. Okay, that's all fine. How will we now operationalize it? How we will make sure that my research question will be answered and my hypothesis proved or disproved. So this is how we get from the big question to smaller categories that are answerable. They will stem from the research question. They are relevant to the answer, but they also need to be quite rigid in looking at their other features. So they need to be exclusive, they need to be exhaustive, and they cannot be too subjective in order to stay replicable. Give you some examples. So let's analyze two very recent tweets by King's College London Twitter account. All right? I'll give you a second to briefly read them. Okay? So let's say we wanted to analyze those tweets using content analysis just to see what kind of content official KCL account has most often. So my first variable is the date of tweet. That's a very good variable, not very interesting one, but it's the one that you cannot really get wrong, right? Whoever will be coding it can just see, as the date is there, you can't get it wrong. It's 14th of March 2019, right? It's not very informative, right? But we need that, right? Now, we're getting to more interesting variables. What is the main topic of the tweet? Politics, entertainment, sports, education. How do you find this variable? Good? No, why not? Well, it's difficult to say which one it would be, sure. And using the language from the previous slide, it's not exhaustive, right? It's not exhaustive. We said it must be exhaustive. It's not, because there are other categories that are not included, right? For example, the first tweet is about, well, what is the topic of the tweet? Student misconduct, right? That's called. And that would be. It's not politics, it's not entertainment, it's not sport, it's not education. That means that our categories were not exhaustive. So that's not good. How can we fix it? Any ideas? The simplest way to fix it is to put E, other, right? So that's one way to do it, right? It's not necessarily a great thing to do it, because we might end up with most of our coding go to the other category, right? We want to avoid that, right? That's why we do pilot. In the pilot, we will see which of the categories roughly are the most popular. And we will make sure we include them in A, B, C, D, E, whatever, until we get to other. Right? So the first step would be adding perhaps more categories if they're very popular, and then, only then, ending with other. But as soon as we insert other, we're exhaustive, right? Because then each of those, at least this tweet will fall definitely under one of these. Okay, next one. What is the type of the tweet? Informational, promotional, discussion, recruiting. What do you think? Well, the problem with this category is that we might try to link it to these categories, and we might get different answers. Because a tweet could well be informational and promotional at the same time. Right? It could be a topic of discussion and information at the same time, for example. This is bad. That means it's not exclusive. These categories need to be exclusive. Need to be exhaustive, but they also need to be exclusive. That means we cannot choose more than one. Unless we specifically ask, choose more than one. But then it creates all sorts of problems in analysis. Usually we want to be exclusive. Lastly, what is the tone of the tweet? Very positive, positive, neutral, negative, very negative. Why are you laughing? And it's not very good. It's not that bad. I agree, though. It's not great. What is the difference between very positive and positive? Right? What is the difference between negative and very negative? It's very subjective. Right? And let's see those tweets. I mean, it's difficult. Obviously, there's something about student misconduct and animal cruelty. So we say, okay, well, the topic is negative, but the tone, is it negative? I mean, it's pretty sort of formal, right? Neutral. It's sort of condensed, but it doesn't. It's not emotional. Right? So what do we mean by these things? Right? So this is where we say, well, first of all, it's not specific enough. We don't know what positive means. We don't know what negative means. It leaves too much to the coder, subjective opinion. How can we make it better? Well, we can either let go of this category at all, but if we're really interested in the sort of basic tone of the tweet, it has been used, we need to make sure that in the code book we explain what do we mean by positive, what do we mean by negative, what do we mean by neutral. Like the very ones need to go, they're bad. But we can stay, let's say, positive, neutral, negative, difficult to say, other. There will be 5 options, right? That's better, right? And then in the code book, we define what do we mean. Well, by positive tweet, we mean tweet that has a positive topic, or it has positively, sort of emotionally positive vocabulary, right? So, cruelty is a negative word, right? In terms of association. The investigation, not good either. They're not good investigations, right? So we could do that. As long as we make it clear, it's clear enough, and it makes sense after the intercoder reliability, we see that it passes the text, then fine. So on our example again, I would say we first start with those boring ones, the ones that we need to have in order to make some sort of comparison. So the date, the main headline, right? Well, somebody will just paste, copy and paste. The number of images, the number of sections, right? If we divide them, this is 1 section, 2, 3, and this one has 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So we will have a number of those categories, and then we might get to ones that help us answer the question, such as is the main text how many words it has, and we can make a scale: 0 to 1,000 words, 1,000 to 1,050. 1,500 and 1,500 to 2,000, for example. Not sure if the size of the font is something we can sort of manually assess, so maybe not that, but surely we could find other categories then to test. So what you do, actually, is you create a code book, and coding book would have all the categories we just discussed and the possible answers, right? So the categories and all the variables and the organized for the coder. It will start with ID number. Each text will have an ID number. Then it will have, well, whatever we're interested in. In this study, we were interested in media from different countries, right? So first would be the country in which article is published. And then you put date of publication, heading. And then the more exciting ones about emotions and about what is in the article. Right? And you would have them ideally in some sort of spreadsheet, because manually it will just be a mess. So you will organize the answers to your code book similarly to this. You would have all the texts here vertically, and each text, the answers to the code book, the coding will go horizontally. Well, so you will then not use the whole words, but the numbers associated with them, right? So first one was the country of publication, right? So we are, let's say the article is from UK, so under 2 we have 1, because UK is 1, right? So country would say 1, right? Date of publication would be date of publication, headline, name of platform, blah, blah, blah. So, and we would analyze first text, and then the second text, and then the third one. And we go until we analyzed all the texts. Right? So you can see the more categories we have, the more exciting it gets for our research question, but the more work it is if we have hundreds of data. Okay, any questions about code books? Coding frames. Good, intercoder reliability then, the exciting stuff. This is where you test it with another person. Why do we do that? So it's replicable. We do it so to show that potentially and practically our content analysis yields the same, or at least close to same results if conducted by another person. We test that by first training this person, telling them this is the code book, this is what we mean by those categories, and these are the texts. Now go and independently code, please, 10% of all the texts. And they do that, and then we compare results. What would a good result be? Good result would be if 80% or more compatibility is observed across our coding. Right? So we would look at it, variable var variable. Right? Date is the same, check. Is this with positive, negative? I put positive, you put negative, that's 0. Right? We would count this across the variable of this 10%, and then we'll end up with percentage, right? Which would represent the ratio between agreed and all coding decisions. So it's sort of how much is required depends on sample, on method, and type of study, what we want to do with this data later. But usually under 70% is trouble. Under 70% means that something needs to be improved. Either the question is not specific enough, the categories might not be exhaustive or exclusive, maybe it's just difficult. What we do then, we revise. We go back to those categories that are trouble. We see if we can change them in a way to make it clearer. We discuss it with the coder. In some cases, we might decide, actually, this needs to go. Right? This is not a good category. This is not a good variable. Right? In the end, we need to make sure by the end of the pilot that we are either that we end up with only those categories that are replicable. If you are planning to do more sophisticated statistical analysis on your data and you want to check those beyond just the ratio of agreed and coding decisions, you might want to consider statistical calculation to look at intercoder reliability. And there's a number of them. I will not go into detail, but if you're interested, we can talk later. Basically what it will do, it will not, instead of telling you just what is the ratio of agreed and total decision, it will give you a more probability of how the coding is reliable or not. This is not something that you necessarily need to do in your content analysis project, but something you might consider. Any questions? ICR? Okay. What then? Then, assuming we have it all coded, we have the pilot coded, the ICR is high enough, then we code everything, and then we look at results. What do we do with our results? The first step we will probably do is simple Frank frequencies, simple descriptive stats. So percentages, right? In how many Guardian articles from 2019 there was less than 500 word article on the page, right? Out of 100%. How many tweets with I did Donald Trump have over the last 3 months, right? So we will look at descriptive statistic, we will cross-tabulate, we will compare different statistics, we will see the relationship between 2 or more variables. It's probably a good idea for the reader to have it visualized, so you might consider different types of visualizations, bars, charts that work for the type of variables that you have. So this would be the basic statistical analysis, descriptives. No need to stop there. There is an exciting world of stats beyond that, which I will not really go into because of time. But I'm happy to talk about this, and I think Daniel, in his lecture about analyzing survey data, he will go a little bit into that. This includes probability testing, t-tests, cluster analysis that lets us group certain features of a text, factor analysis, and so on. Doesn't mean you have to do all those complicated tests. My usual answer is that, will they help you answer the question? Right? So the type of analysis you want will depend on what you want to find out. If you really need to find out something that requires very complicated stats and you don't know how to do that, then maybe this is the time to either learn stats or reconsider your research question. Okay. Lastly, in terms of analysis, there is a side of it which I haven't mentioned so far. We were talking about manual coding so far, right? We were gathering the data, we were doing it all manually. We decided whether this tweet is positive or negative, right? We were counting how many words are there. There's a strand of content analysis that we can call machine-aided or computer-aided or automatic that does this for us with the help of algorithms and big data analysis. This allows us to look for in a broader scope, large sample, because we save time on analysis, right? The machine does it for us. However, the types of possible questions to answers are limited because the tools are just tools, they're not humans, right? The tools are getting better. So, for example, sentiment analysis is the type of analysis where the computer, by analysis of certain words, whether they're positive or negative, decides whether a text has a certain emotional range. But they're still sort of not great, right? They make a lot of mistakes. They're not great, especially in cross-cultural, cross-language studies, studies across large amounts of time, because language changes, imagery changes. The computer is not very good in catching those nuanced differences. So I'll leave it at here. It's definitely possible for you to do this, but it requires some thought of what are you gaining and what are you losing. The one thing I would mention is that the use of machine encoding does not make it less subjective. Because you cannot say, well, the machine did it, thus the human bias is eliminated. On the contrary, I mean, it's exactly the same, right? Somebody wrote the algorithm, you inputted the coding categories, you inputted the search terms. In terms of being more or less objective, it doesn't make per se any difference. So summing up, the strengths of content analysis discussed today is that it's really good for comparisons, all sorts of comparisons. It enables generalization as one of a few techniques that allow that. It's replicable, which adds to validity, credibility of the method. And it's widely applicable because of the wide definition of what a text is. We can apply it to many things related to media, communication, technology, and anything digital or not. The drawbacks, the limitations of content analysis are that it's quite superficial. As we saw on the examples, it works best when the variables are simple. But when the variables are simple, then the questions that we're asking are not especially exciting. Right? We're asking about presence or absence, trends. So there's sort of give and take, right? The most interesting variables will have problems with ICR. Right? So there's a balance there between not having only boring categories, very simple answers, and also staying within the brackets of replicability. What is a common mistake with content analysis is the causation and correlation. Content analysis cannot prove causation. We cannot assess cause and effect just by analyzing trends and patterns. We can see, using statistical analysis, whether two factors are correlated, but we cannot say that one causes another. Content analysis will not tell us why behind those patterns. We'll establish patterns. It will not tell us why is this pattern like that. Where is the difference coming from? It will not tell us why the politician tweets that way, why Guardian changed that way. And most importantly, it will not tell us what the readers, the viewers, the listeners think about this. So we cannot really presume that audience will have a certain response to this tabloidization or this language of tweets. This is not the subject of the study. We're staying purely with the text. We're not talking about the audiences, we're not talking about effects, just what is in the text. Right. Questions? Yes? Yes, but not all of them, right? 10%. Yeah.
It can be anybody.
Anybody. It can be anybody. You have to explain it to them, right? You have to go through the code together, just so they're clear what the categories mean, and then they do it independently, and then you compare results. Yes. In any content analysis, regardless of what the text is, ICR is important. Any more questions? Okay, I'll be here, as I usually am. In 2 weeks, our last session, writing your dissertations. Bring any questions you have, because that's it in terms of me. I'm signing off. And then it's just you and your supervisor. And there are also some optional seminars still happening in the next 2 weeks. That you can sign up for, and especially connection with today's lecture is the one about surveys, because it's also a quantitative method. That's it, thank you. no deadline. It's up to your supervisor.
Oh, so I should check with my
Yes.
supervisor.
It's usually April.
But when April, like beginning of
That's
April?
up to your supervisor. There's no deadline for me. Yeah, that's up to their, because they need to have time to read it and give you feedback. So we're saying roughly in April, but the specific date is up to your supervisor.
So it's not coming through the piece?
No.
Oh,
No, it's just you send them email.
directly?
Yeah, directly.
Okay.
And then Keats is only the whole dissertation. And then there's the ethics form with the differences. But you don't submit any chapters to Keats.
But like the ethics deadline also depends on your team.
No, ethics deadline is 15 of May.
But sorry, my supervisor say like it's like end of March. I think it's because he wanted it before.
So that's, yeah, you know, that's,
Okay.
yeah, if they want it earlier, they might want it
So he
earlier.
can decide.
Yeah. For me, as absolute deadline for everyone, that's 15 of May.